Welcome to a very special Greenshoots series all about cross-border payments, a topic that is very close to my heart. I've been involved in payments since probably early 2000s, working on real-time payment systems. And for those that don't know, Greenshoots is an initiative we started way back in 2020. It was something that, when I was involved in MAS, we wanted to have a platform for founders in particular that were going through some really dark times. And so we ran a number of community-based sessions to support this community through the dark times, ultimately, of the pandemic. And not saying that the pandemic is over, but it kind of feels like it is. And so we ran investor-based sessions. We ran sessions with seasoned founders that had experienced downturns. And so what we wanted to do with Greenshoots is start to build this out to be a full-on kind of public and private sector platform. And so over the years, since 2020, we've had a number of governments make announcements on Greenshoots. And more recently, we've started to work with corporates such as Ant Group to have sessions in which they could talk about important kind of opportunities and issues in the system. So just to introduce myself, my name is Pat Patel. I am the Executive Director of Elevandi. Elevandi is an organization that we span out from the MAS earlier this year, and it is a business that does a few things. So our raison d'etre is to foster an active dialogue between the public and the private sector. And ultimately, we want to advance fintech in the digital economy. And so we do this by connecting people and businesses, so activities such as this. We connect ideas, so the ideas that may come out of this session, hopefully, and also insights, so insights that truly move the market forward. And so we've been involved in a number of activities this year, and we have one really big one coming up at the end of the year, and that's the Singapore FinTech Festival. And so each year at the festival, we pick a theme that we get the industry to really get behind. And so we work closely with MAS to really think through what is the theme, what is the cause that we should be focusing on, not just as the public sector or the private sector, but as the community as a whole. In previous years, we've covered topics such as sustainability, financial inclusion, people and talent, and then for those that can remember, last year was all about Web3 and why Web3 is a game changer within the industry. So when you've covered all these topics, the question is, where do you go? And so we thought long and hard, and we started to think about the current state of the market, in particular what's going on in the public and private sector markets. Also, with the emerging downturn that's happening in multiple countries, what does this mean? And so we wanted to kind of focus on a topic that should influence the industry, and that topic is around resilient business models. And so for this year's festival, we're going to focus on deconstructing what the essence of a resilient business model is. And so you've got three lenses to this, in our humble opinion. One is all around the viability. So how does a business model make revenues? How does it make it sustainable? The second is around responsibility. So how does it contribute to our ESG goals that the world has set itself? And then the last one, which I think is relevant to this topic, is around inclusivity. So there's a few lenses to inclusivity. The first lens is around the unbanked and the underbanked, but also those that are living on the margins of society through no fault of their own are currently living on the fringes. And so how do business models contribute to bringing these individuals into the system? The second nuance to this is around open and interoperability. So how are we building models operationally, but also your business model to be open and interoperable? And I think one of the topics that will be covered today is around that connectivity, to have open and interoperable systems. So I think on that note, I'd like to introduce Camilla, who's been doing some great work in this space. Can you please come to the stage?
Probably doubling up, so...
Be louder.
I'm going to sit down from the beginning. There we go. So thank you, Elevandi. It's a pleasure to be here, both for me and for the Emerging Payments Association Asia. It's quite a while since we were in Singapore, so delighted to be back. It's great to have co-created this event with you and your team. Sagari and her team has been fantastic. And also thank you to Anne for hosting us today. And especially to Carrie, who you're going to meet soon on the panel. Carrie is also part of our advisory board, and she's been very supportive in activities that we've been having leading up to this event and to the article that we issued last week that some of you might have read. If you haven't, we'll share it again afterwards. Highly encourage you to read it. If you haven't come across the Emerging Payments Association Asia before, we are the leading branch organization for payments participants in the APAC. So anybody who moves money or support the movements of money. We are by members, for members, and we're really focused on policy and advocacy to create a level playing field with a vision of improving lives everywhere. And I'm so happy to see members, ambassador, advisory board in the room. We couldn't do those things, it wasn't for you. And we're going to talk about cross-border payments today. So the FSB and BIS has done a great deal to put focus on this topic. And in our article, we wrote that we want cross-border payments to be as easy as making an international phone call. We wrote that, and then I read it afterwards, and I thought, it hasn't always been that easy to make an international phone call. I remember when I came to Australia as a student and wanted to call home to my parents in Sweden, and I would have to go down to the corner shop, get the phone card, walk another 200 meters to find a phone booth, because it was cheaper than via the mobile network. I would scratch the card, get the digit code, flip the card, access number to where to call to Sweden, pin in the code. They would tell me you have 45 minutes or 15 minutes. And then the phone number, and then finally it started to ring, and then I would cross my fingers that it would not be an echo or delay on the line, because that would mean I would hang up and redo the process. So we've come so far, but how far have we come in enhancing cross-border payments to make it really a seamless journey that is affordable, fast, and accessible for everybody? So I said FSB, BIS has really put focus in the project that they're doing around enhancing cross-border payments. And they've given us that target and that KPI of costs, transparency, speed, and access. So we have the KPIs. But what I also think they've done is to given us the front of the puzzle box, so we know where we're heading. And all of us here today, we're a puzzle piece holder, and now we're going to try to start to compare. Who have the corner pieces? Who has the edges? Who has that colorful piece that makes it easier to start to build and create the picture or interoperability? And with that in mind, let's get some puzzle piece holder on the stage. So I would like to welcome Stephen Shan from PayPal. Stephen is the International Head of Government Affairs and Public Relations for Asia Pac and LATAM. We have Carrie Suen. She is Senior Advisor at Ant Group since 2014, I think. Yes. And we also have Jason Thompson, CEO at Partior, previously CEO of OVO, and also worked at Grab. And please give an applause, because he's not in the room, to Stephen Haley. There we go, Stephen.
Yay!
From Mumbai, he is leading the expansion of Mojaloop, which is the world's first open source real-time payments interoperable platform that is backed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So, I'm going to ask a question first to all of you so we can set the scene and the room can get to know you. I'll start with you, Carrie, as the host of today. How does Ant Group sit in this conversation and the topic that we're going to talk about? What do you stand for?
Yeah, I personally look at this topic as like really my baby, because like we've been looking into this space since 2014 when we are looking to bring China Wallet outside of China. So in case people here don't know what our focus is on, so from day one, our business model is designed around how to fill that market gap and serve the segment of consumer those haven't been served. And really with a grand mission to bring green, sustainable, and inclusive changes to the world. So I think one thing that is important to us is the mindset, creating small but incremental improvements to our user journey could also be very powerful, because what we're doing is essentially building a very trusted community for these segment of consumers who have been underserved, so they can also transact cross-border seamlessly with the merchants that they desire globally. On the other hand, we also focus on enhancing the digital capabilities of our SMEs. So I'll go into that a little bit more, how we are doing that in our journey. So I think Web 3.0 have received a lot of attention, and Elevanti has also led the effort of Point Zero Forum in Zurich in June to talk about what that space and development mean. But I urge everybody, the world we are in right now still have a lot of pain points that haven't been resolved yet. So how do we work together to bridge those gaps? I think it's a very urgent topic to me, actually.
Thank you. We'll come back to all of those things later on. I'm going to turn to Steve on the screen so he doesn't feel excluded to go second.
All right, great. So, I work for the Mojaloop Foundation, and this is really core to our business, to what we're trying to do. The ability to move money for all people, to be able to move money from any person to any person. That means from any account to any account. And that means particularly the folks that Pat was talking about, the unbanked, but the underbanked in particular, those that are living on the fringes. And that means making sure that we include the financial institutions that are best serving them. And that means we don't only focus on big urban banks. And so that's where Mojaloop Foundation, I think, is very much focused, is how can we make sure that the payment system that we are designing, both for domestic and cross-border, is going to be inclusive of not just banks, but rural banks, wallets, microfinance institutions, credit unions, so that the institutions that are serving those underbanked and people on the fringes are also included. And that's how we actually get to that type of scale. And so to do that, we built an open source payment platform that is a real-time payment switch doing clearing and settlement that aims to lower the cost of low-value transactions between financial institutions. And we can do that for a variety of ways, but that is the main aim that we have. And again, that's both for domestic and for cross-border. And more recently, we're trying to focus not just on the clearing and routing components of that in our open source library, but also we recently launched a CBDC Center of Excellence there in Singapore, which focuses on how CBDCs can be used to reduce the cost of settlement for cross-border as well, the cost and time per settlement. And so we really are looking at what are ways in which we as a community and we as an open source community can reduce the cost for all of you who have businesses in payments to actually use this infrastructure.
Excellent, thank you. We'll hear more about that also through this session. Jason.
Hey there. So before we jump in, first interesting fact, 10 years ago, Baker Street in London, EPA brand was announced. And back then I sat on the board with Tony Craddock, and we talked about changing the world of payments a decade ago. And since then I've been nomadic in Asia, aged quite a bit, and I think you guys have achieved a lot. So it's a real pleasure to be back and joining the EPA today. And I'll reach out to Tony this evening and just cycle back on those 10 years. But when we think about Partior, we think about what's happening and the work that Mojaloop and many organizations are doing. I think what we're talking about here is an industrial scale change management. And no one area, we look at the incredible work that's been done in fintech by somebody like Ant, and you look at the scale of the impact, but we're still not impacting the way money moves around the world. Partior sits in the permission space. We look at the regulation, we think about how regulation changes the pace, etc. And so you have to bring innovation that is deliverable, scalable, and allows data to allow decision-making by regulators, governments, and indeed financial institutes. So I think we're taking a very pragmatic approach to this, and also a non-offensive approach that we need to work with different organizations. I look around the room and there's many organizations we're already working with, the company that's only 9 months old. So I think, we're at a pace and a place now where innovation is key. And Singapore is key to that innovation. So I'm also very proud to be leading a new company in Singapore that's headquartered here and building that technology out of Asia for the rest of the world. But there's a huge amount of work to do as a first-generation company. Very similar to Mojaloop, I think.
Fantastic, thank you. Last but not least, Stephen.
I want to thank Elevendi, Ant Group, and EPA Asia for organizing this event. I think all of you may have heard PayPal and have used PayPal in the past. We're one of the earlier fintech companies. 20 years ago, PayPal was just a checkout button off eBay. Throughout the past 2 decades, we've evolved to become a digital wallet. And as we look forward, PayPal aspires to be a super app. And what that means is that to be the center and part of the ecosystem of your e-commerce journey, online, offline. And so to your question about the different pieces of the puzzle, I think depending on where you are in the business, I think all businesses strive to grow. And so PayPal's journey has been a really phenomenal journey, especially through COVID. And the reason why this topic is so important for us is we are now in about 200 markets around the world. We have about 430 million users, of which 35 million are merchants. And SMEs make up a really critical part of PayPal's ecosystem. And so having the ability to facilitate payments across these markets are so critical because it supports SME as they try to scale, as they try to look for global consumers. And interoperability is so critical in that process. And so I'm glad that the focus globally, regionally, and as well as individual markets are looking at this issue because it's so important for many global companies as they try to help SMEs and the e-commerce in this growth.
Yeah, I'm happy you used that word interoperability because it's probably the most used word in the EPA world, but also the first question is going to be about that. So what trends do you see? What is happening in the space of interoperability?
I think you touched on in your introduction, I think there is definitely a lot of focus right now on this topic, especially at the global level. We have seen BIS has put out a single rulebook where interoperability is one of the key features when they look at industry and government partnership. You have FSB, G20 roadmap, looking at different aspects of cross-border payments and payment infrastructure, and of which interoperability is also a key feature as part of that. And then you also see a lot of focus in the region, and you look at just Southeast Asia, where we sit here in Singapore today. There's a lot of efforts are being made in the cross-border space. You look at Thailand and Singapore. Last year's launched the connection. Singapore is in a part of the Project Nexus. And also there's a lot of discussions among regulators in Southeast Asia to create linkages in the cross-border payment space. So you have a lot of interest, a lot of focus, because interoperability is will be a foundational for cross-border payments. At the same time, you have forces pushing that back. You have markets where there are focus on domestic interests, whether it is around local content data requirements, around licensing issues, taxation, a lot of focus on that as well. That also puts pressure on a lot of the progress that are now starting to be made on the cross-border space. So it'll be interesting to see how this will balance out. I think as a company in different markets, we definitely would like to have more interoperable systems, regulatory and legal frameworks. But there are increasing pressure at the domestic level. As I mentioned earlier, just an example of the few. And I think as part of that, it's critical for industry to work closely with governments and regulators to really find a balance, in addressing the needs that they have, at the same time, making sure that regulations have space for innovation, for new technologies, as well as for kind of additional initiatives that will come into this space.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to Steve to comment on this also, because in our think tanks leading up to this, we were talking about it's not black and white when it comes to interoperability, that it actually different nuances of it. So, Steve, tell us, what do you think is happening in this space, and how do you see it out of Mojaloop?
I think what that comment you made about the idea that it is nuanced. I think that's a trend that we're seeing, that we're having more nuanced conversations. But when I started working on interoperability, the term was used primarily just for this idea of peer-to-peer transactions and only an account to an account, like a domestic remittance primarily, and then also thinking of a cross-border remittance. And I think the conversation has moved beyond that, and it's becoming more nuanced, and the other transactions are also important, and we need the same set of rails, the same process to define the other use cases, and in particular, merchant use cases. And I think that's a trend that we're seeing in the real-time payment space that's growing. I mean, as I mentioned, I live in Mumbai, and UPI is not hitting 6 billion transactions a month off of peer-to-peer. It's off of merchant transactions. And so I think that's a trend that we're starting to see. And I think to Stephen's point of those relationships between those real-time payment systems in each country, like between Thailand and Singapore, we've also seen that our UPI here is interoperable and growing in its interoperability with Singapore, where I'll be able to use my UPI app to make merchant payments. And that's what we'd like to get to. And so that brings me to the next trend within real-time payments that I think is interesting to see. When I use my UPI app to pay for something at a merchant in Singapore, I'm not going to be using my bank app. I'm going to be using a third-party app that is connected to my bank. And I don't know anybody who uses their bank app to actually make transactions. Third-party payment initiation and PISP, I think, is a major trend that we're going to see in the world of real-time payments, and that these types of third-party apps, rather than the bank apps, are going to be what consumers are actually using. And that's a good thing for inclusivity, because those technology companies are very often better at acquiring customers. So it's not only the trend that we're seeing, but it's, in my opinion, a great trend for inclusivity. And we need to make sure that when we're thinking about cross-border interoperability, we're taking that into consideration, because it is a trend that we're seeing domestically. And if we all start trying to transact cross-border and none of us know how to use our bank apps because we're all using fintech apps, it's really not going to, it's not going to work. It's not going to spread. So I think that's where those are some of the main trends I'd like to highlight.
Yep, the navigation between different things, that should be interoperable. Carrie, I know do you have a lot of thoughts on this also around interoperability and different ways of using it?
I kind of want to ride on Stephen and Steve's comments just now, and want to put it up front in case I forget about this line. User experience is so critical to digital financial inclusion. The reason I say it is because I want to kind of give that perspective. Obviously, the central bank system connectivity is one layer, but there's so many different layers of services that we are providing. So last year at the Singapore FinTech Festival, we announced Alipay Plus. So why are we launching a product and we are not operating another version of Alipay China wallet outside of China? Is because, first of all, like we see, actually there's so many different culture aspects, consumer behavior that differ across region and country. So we believe someone else is better at doing that job. So that's why we look at our 18 years of experience and see what else can we offer that will be complementary to all these efforts that has been done already domestically, serving their local consumer and on a local transaction basis. So I think what is critical to these digital wallets is really interoperability, if you think about it, because the success lies on growing both the consumer and the merchant markets very quickly at a very limited time period to capture that critical mass to make it sustainable. So, again, they're already doing that domestically. So, but when it comes to cross-border payment, it's actually far more complicated. And then I think Stephen will have a lot to say about, just look at the different regulations, the regulatory expectations, data regulation, data transferability, all these complex issues, right? But I think just bringing from a consumer journey, if each digital wallet have to connect with each merchant at one time, it's going to take them very, very long time. So how can we help these digital wallets while they're doing well domestically? We can help them, connect cross-border with global merchants in a much more efficient, seamless, cost-effective manner. So this is what Alipay Plus was all about. But I think I think the efforts that has been taken on the public sector, including what Partior is doing, is very encouraging because they realize at least there's some inefficiency at the processing level, at the clearing level. So removing those intermediaries also will help, fintech companies like us, right? Because we are also bank users. Actually, bank partners are very key partners of ours. We have a CEO of Next Bank here. So I think if we can really push to improve that layer of clearing efficiency, then a company like us can really commit and focus more on the value propositions, value products that we can offer to SMEs. I think today, other than payments, also interestingly, they're looking beyond just payments. They're looking more, business analytics, marketing solution that can keep the customer coming to the store. It's not just a one-off. So Camilla, you and I talked about at lunch, right? Right now, a lot of these kind of instant payment, a lot of the commercial incentives may not be quite there, right? Because like banks are actually doing it at a very low cost. So how do we help merchants to see there's actually continuous benefit to continue use digital tools is also very key.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of conversation around that, like how when you start to connect up that you don't go bilateral, that you try to avoid that spaghetti factory that could happen, and why interoperability is so important between networks. So that is a good lead into you, Jason, to see how do you see on interoperability?
Yeah, so first of all, building on Carrie, as you know, I spent 4 years in Indonesia and arrived in the market when e-money penetration was virtually zero. We very quickly worked together in the industry there and integrated banks, etc. Cost of funds in the wallets around that time was just under double digit, around 8.59%. I think Ant Financial in China at the time was around 2%. And without policy, without good systems and processes, domestically, we were able to build interoperability across all the top 10 banks, across the wallets, across the merchants, and you could send money instantly from Makassar to Jakarta to Bali, and that happens today with millions of users. So you can overcome domestic interoperability with effort. What I see in the field of Partior, Partior is focused on three things: speed, number one; cost efficiency, number two; and transparency, upholding regulation, number three. When you start to move cross-border, I think one of the things that we see as the biggest inhibitor is legacy. We can talk about interoperability, but legacy in this industry is huge. And actually, when we think about legacy, we always think about the bank and put it on the bank. There are some fantastically innovative banks. They've hired some amazing people, and technology is in the main board. So actually, when we come to fintechs as well, non-bank financial services, we see huge limitations. So as we think about the industry and change management, one of the things that I'm very careful to do is not position Partior as an offensive force, but as a complementary force. How do we deliver a first-generation interoperable network that can be used for many facets? And one of the lessons for me, because I was originally in infrastructure and then moved into wallets, was whenever I see one of these fintech verticals suddenly grow, you normally see an inefficiency in existing policy or infrastructure. So if we think about how the remittance business changed globally, a lot of that was just around the capability of the bank to net clear. Today, we see, I'm a user of DBS and I send money to Australia and it's instant or PayPal, there's many different ways. So I think when we just say interoperability, I think it's very easy and overused. The industry isn't going to throw out billions of dollars of infrastructure. So we have to learn, as BIS has done, to create standards of integration. And we have to also be open and I think being very open from a policy perspective, but also from a strategic perspective, that we can use the infrastructure collectively. So certainly my view is, Partior is an open network. if somebody wants to run an application for PVP, liquidity online as a service or DVP, they should be allowed to, and I should not see that data. And so this open-mindedness to multifaceted new infrastructure, I think, is critical. And we work with Ant Financial, we work with banks, etc. So I just feel interoperability is too easily labeled. Actually, it's a huge amount of effort. And I do like the idea of approaching this, Alexandra, is through standards and having more standards from technology whilst we're waiting for policy to catch up.
Yeah, it's good. Steve, talking about interoperability and standards specifically, I know you're doing some work and case study around standards and your approach to that. Would that fit to share here?
Yeah, sure. I think, and I want to thank Jason for that lead into interoperability around technology standards, which is the focus of Mojaloop. We believe that, all these real-time payments systems around the world are being developed independently, and their ability to talk to each other is going to be a technological problem. But it's also going to be a policy problem, and it's also going to be a regulatory problem, and it's also going to be a user experience problem. And we'll get into this hopefully later on, but the fact that the problem in Indonesia of wallets and banks in every country is very often they have different regulators and different policies, and to Carrie's point, different business models. And so getting those different groups to interoperate with each other is a very significant problem. But let me focus more on that user experience comment that I made, though, and that's what we're trying to work on with a cross-border proof of concept that we're doing between Singapore and Myanmar and Singapore and Philippines with some of our community members. And again, it's just a proof of concept, but the idea is, you can have technology standards like ISO 20022, like different APIs, but really making sure that the user experience, the user has a very standard and simplified experience. And like, for example, we all know everywhere we go in the world, you walk up to an ATM, everybody knows what to do. It's a very simple and standard experience. And we would like to get to the same point for cross-border. And I think when we look at the trends domestically of using aliases like phone numbers, that is an area where I don't think we've done a very good job. And I think it's an area where cross-border standards, I don't think have really had enough thinking. QR as a merchant payment, I think we've largely standardized that user experience with merchant-presented static QR across a large number of markets. But the user experience of using aliases has not been standardized. And so this is what we're working on with this proof of concept is how do we simplify the experience by using an alias? And I think most of PayPal definitely uses aliases, Ant uses aliases. But a lot of people use them in different ways. So when I want to send money cross-border, I want to enter in the phone number of the person that I'm sending money to, even if that phone number is, that the account that it's attached to that phone number is not just at a different financial service provider, potentially at a different class of financial service provider, a wallet instead of a bank, and in a different country under a different regulatory regime. That's a complicated problem in itself. Forget the settlement, forget the clearing. Just how can we resolve that alias and make sure that it is unique? And then how can we use that alias resolution to also do all the necessary KYC, AML fraud, and CTF checks to make sure that instantaneously we know that that transfer is going to be accepted by the sending institution. And so this is what we're trying to do with that proof of concept, is really focus on that experience and how can a sending institution, whether a wallet or a bank, communicate with their national switch, and then also communicate with the receiving institution's switch, which then communicates with multiple types of financial institutions to make sure that the not only is that alias resolved, but the adequate KYC information is sent. So you have that simplified standard experience. And we're finding this is a much more complicated problem than is anticipated, not just because of, for a lot of reasons, the back ends of the wallets and the banks don't share that KYC information as easily as you might think they would. And regulators have different requirements for KYC. And the requirement for a single phone number to be linked to a single account is different in every country. So all of those challenges we have to figure out how to resolve. So that's the purpose of this POC is let's identify where those challenges are and then publish something where we can demonstrate this is what we found and this is where we think there still needs to be some standardization across markets just for that one particular issue. I guess what we're trying to solve is this problem where the sender has to insert a whole bunch of their own KYC information or a whole bunch of their receiver's KYC information when in reality, both the sending and the receiving institutions have that information. We shouldn't require the sender to also insert that information. We want to simplify that experience, but standardize that simplified experience. While just a caveat, because I'm sure there are a few broad people in the room who are saying that's really risky, making sure we do it in a safe way and in a way that the sender has a very clear confirmation that they're sending their money to the right person. So yeah, it's a great POC that we're working on. I hope we'll be able to publish something within the next 6 months about that.
It's a great example, and I think you have 140 eyes on you now and thinking we will follow this one because it's so many different challenges in there, but if you solve them, it can really move us in the right direction. So Stephen, I know this is touching on lots of different things that we often talking about, from security and cyber to trust to regulations to, when you think about standards and what Stephen has said now, what would you like to add to that?
No, just to build on to what my fellow panelists have said, I think partnership is going to be key. You know, for global players who may not have infinite resources, to your point about very distinct domestic standards, there are domestic players who are really good at what they do, and also domestic players who want to scale, but they don't have the infrastructure globally. And so I think that's where big players like Ant Financial, Alipay, you know, PayPal, you know, the banks could come in and partner. I think the challenge, to Stephen's point, is not that this is a AML KYC course, is that I think regulators sometimes have a difficult time understanding partnership and what that entails. And even with the right partnership in place and the right licensing in place, they still feel that they need to have some oversight, some supervision, additional KYC, additional AML, and that can create tons of complexity, to your point about just the unique number, right? It could be an ID number, it could be a mobile phone number. Yeah, it could be in some jurisdictions requiring biometrics when there are no infrastructure no vendors, third-party vendors, infrastructure in the market to support, you know, your KYC. These are really real practical challenges for businesses. But I think partnership would be the key because there are global payments players, global banks, e-commerce platforms that can really support. But again, you know, they can leverage the domestic players who are really good at what they do and can really fulfill the local standards and the local regulatory requirements. I think just making sure that the type of partnerships that are in place, that governments and regulators understand that and have regulations that recognize and support that, that then can help facilitate standardization, interoperability, and allow, you know, business to be able to scale.
Yeah, that the standards can, as we describe it now, can almost be like that double sword. It makes it easy to be interoperable, but it can also mean that people are excluded. I think anybody who's been touching on ISO 20022 knows that it's lots of different dialect and it's a very costly project to get it right. So if you don't have big budget, you might not be able to get there. So Carrie, we often talking about this standards being creating access or not. So do you want to have your take and reflect on Steve? We keep on bouncing here on the topic.
Everyone has very good ideas. I think generally, I think as we all probably acknowledge, standards could be very positive development because it creates some type of common language at least, right? When we talk to regulator, for example, oh, this is ISO 2XXXX. So at least, oh, you know, there's been extensive discussion and study around the standards. So it should be acceptable, right? So actually, Antwerp, we have been leading two ISO working group in the past 2 years. One is on QR code minimum security standard. One is on eKYC technology. So just an example, right? QR code has been a very mainstream payment method. But right now in the market, there are also many types of QR code technologies. So leading that discussion group, we can also bring the industry expert from the country members to talk about what minimum standard, security standard mean to them, because everyone have a very different expectations on that. So this is an example where standard can bring people together and then create common understanding and potentially lower the market entry barrier, right? Because if a new player coming into the space, at least they know, oh, you know, this is what is considered as minimum, as a best practice, right? There's also other set of standards where it's more top-down, right? For example, like, again, quoting the central bank initiatives, you know, linking the central bank systems together and creating another standard around that. So I think all these efforts could be complementary, but as long as, like, you know, we keep the end-to-end flow in mind, right? When we talk about building highways, we don't just build it for the sake of building it so it's there, right? We actually need to look at where I want to get from point A to point B, and then I build the highway accordingly, right? So that is like another form of standard. And then I think from a policy perspective, I'm sure all these governments are also thinking how to help these SMEs to grow and scale as quickly as possible. How do I help these migrant workers to send money more cost effective and efficiently across border? So I think it's clear, you know, who are the end users, but how about the quality of that last mile delivery? Because, you know, when you set some standard in this flow, inherently it may affect or benefit that other building block that will be connected to this standard. So I think it's important that, you know, whoever's setting those standards should think about, you know, the onboarding process, what are the costs implicated, and whether the access could be provided to participants who have a genuine interest to leverage it, you know. So when I drive from San Francisco to LA, I can choose the coastal road, I can choose driving through the desert, because maybe I want to check out the sea view, right? So, you know, different people have different journey that they are trying to create. So maybe different highways are better for different purpose. So can we keep that more open, more accessible? So I think this is the purpose of standard.
I think that's something that's also been coming out of the first couple of rounds of discussion with FSB, that it's horses for courses, to use an expression, that everybody wants the different things. It should be an option, like you might not need to have it in 2 days. It could maybe take a week and you pay less. And so it's really to be aware of who is it that making and using it. Jason, we're touching lots on standards here. You want to reflect on this topic?
Yeah, I'd like to take it back to usage models. And because we're talking so unilaterally across markets and usage models, and that's not how consumerism, merchant SMB, or enterprise payments really work. You know, and financial is an amazing case study. You know, with the work I was doing in Southeast Asia was not inventing the wheel; it was localizing your wheel. You know, and so when I look back, I remember when I first got into payments, I was at Microsoft, and we wanted to integrate payments into O365, into Xbox, games for Windows. And I went to see some amazing companies, and they basically told me, yep, $10, 24-hour clearing. So can you imagine any gamers in here, Call of Duty, something like that, you're just about to get shot. Okay, can I come back tomorrow? Because I need to pay. And today, you know, I'm walking around, my daughter needs some money at school, I send it over, I may pay for a subscription or Visa through Nets. I may use a wallet, I move money interoperability within my wallet. That didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen overnight in China, and it didn't happen overnight here. And the policy wasn't set and told us how to do it. Actually, what happened was innovation, and there was a lack of policy. And if the policy that's happening in China now had happened 10 years ago, you know, we forget that Ant Financial's 16 years, 17 years old, 18, yeah. And I remember I was very fortunate to spend some time with Eric and the team years ago when I was building Grab, Grab Financial Group, and they were teaching us about how they built it. It was amazing. I look now, and what we're trying to do is create a framework, and let's get everybody to sit in there. So let's talk about interoperability. And I think, Steve, when you talk about it, I start to see things like retail and wholesale transaction networks. I don't see the difference. I just see infrastructure, and I see policy, and I see governance, and I uphold in transparency. I don't see separate infrastructure. But the industry isn't set up like that, and policy isn't set up like that, so it's stopping innovation. So then we think about the change. Let's go back and think about Office. You remember, who bought Office as a box? CD-ROM, you remember it was awful, the experience. I think I was a product manager then. And so, you know, now you just don't do that. But at the time, let's remember that when organizations like Digital River, C2000, they were distributing the software, somebody else was doing the payment, there was massive arbitrage fraud, massive. So what are we going to do here? Are we going to allow DVP, an asset or a bond, to be distributed separately to a financial transaction? Because the policy for asset, value exchange, isn't as developed as the policy for cross-border exchange. For me, this won't work. If you try, innovation has to have an environment to innovate. It has to have an opportunity to fail, not as a site, you know, we saw with stable coins. It cannot be on that scale. But it has to have an environment where organizations like these work together and they find the innovation, and it's a process. And actually, you can't get it out of the box. And so what I'm seeing is there isn't logic around, there isn't enough freedom for us to operate. There's too much constraint. And I think as an industry, and I think this is a great environment in Singapore to do this, that we need to be able to innovate. We need to be able to see how retail and cross-border transactions and wholesale transactions can happen. And as Steve, you said, I don't believe that customers think so laterally. Customers think about what they want to achieve, not the channel. And so they need to be allowed to merge and to be interoperable from the user experience. So I believe that at Partior, I believe fintech, bank, and service provider will coexist on our network.
So that sounds great, and I totally agree, but how do we make that happen? What can we do as an industry, as companies, as regulator? What are the things we should see more of, specifically for doing that long term and to be sure that financial inclusion reaches its full potential?
Yeah, so, you know, what's our wish list? I think despite the lack of environment, I think we're doing this. You know, we're looking at specific usage models. You know, we're working with bond issuance companies. They can issue a bond in 60 seconds, but they can clear it in 3 days. That sounds like we can issue it in 3 days. So we're working with these organizations like, how do we cooperate? How do we make this happen together? But there's not a great deal of freedom for that to happen. I think one of the things that I really like about the ASEAN community is we use sandboxes readily in proof of concept. And those sandboxes exist cross-border, as Mojaloop are doing across 3 countries, as we've been doing. They exist on things like digital asset movement. They exist on things like payment policy and identity. If you think about China, if China wasn't allowed to run with a sub-KYC wallet, where would we be on wallet penetration in China today? Very, very small. It was the lack of the absolute clarity that allowed innovation. If you ask me what we need some sandboxes, and we also need to do something we're not very good at as men. We need to leave our ego outside and go in and play and work out what that is.
Let's get started. Put one foot in front of the other and see where we land. Steve, from where you're sitting, what do you think we should do more of?
I'd love to just all sit here and think about what Jason just said and just let everyone absorb that. I think the sandbox comment is exactly correct. There are a couple of companies in the room that have $100 million to go out and try to change the world. Good luck to you. But I think what I would prefer is that some of those companies maybe invest something closer to $10,000 or $50,000 to actually join a group. And that's the other thing, again, the point on ego, exactly. Can 2 or 3 big organizations come together and join a sandbox, join a proof of concept, leaving their egos and their future business model off the table for the moment, and just see what are the obstacles that it's going to take for us to actually get this off the ground. And I think if we don't do more of that, then we're all going to get stuck. I like to use the example of there's this massive cake sitting in the middle of the table, and a whole bunch of hungry people are trying to figure out, how do I divide up this massive cake? Why don't we make a cupcake and let's just all agree we all take one bite and go home, but at least we get to taste it and see what it is and move forward. We need to do more of those types of proof of concepts where we're not thinking and having to get approval for what's going to be our 20-year business policy or business plan. In part of that, though, it's not, we talk about one thing that comes up very often I'd like to focus on is the relationship between even domestic regulators. There was an example in a POC that we recently ran into in Afghanistan, where a lot of people put a lot of work into that low KYC advocacy for wallets. And they said, great, as long as somebody has a SIM card, they don't need any KYC information, they can open up a wallet. Well, it turns out there's a different regulator that says, well, in order to buy a SIM card, you have to have all of this KYC information. And so the fact that we need to move outside of just central bankers, there are a lot of other regulators that impact our lives and a lot of other government agencies. And so I do think we should be thinking about the open communication, not just between the regulators and the corporates and the business and the banks, but also among different government agencies within a country, because it isn't just the financial regulators. We have to be involved in this.
This is the stage in the conversation where I really have to hold back to not go with all my ideas and like just to actually let the panel speak. I just have to add one thing, and I think sandboxes is brilliant, but also to publish and show the results from them. It's so hard to draw at what actually happened, and if we don't see the case studies, what was created, we can't spread it out to all the people that's also not in this room. Stephen, what do you think we should do more of?
No, I concur, and I think the other thing that industry can do more is to help raise awareness. You would be surprised that, government, they're not monolithic, right? They are users as well. A lot of governments are going through digitalization, so they themselves are tackling these same issues. And I think the more that we can make them aware of the products that we have, and some of them could be very technical, very, very nuanced, at the same time, be part of their journey as they pursue digitalization. I think that could help to address some of the challenges, whether it's standards, whether it is dealing with cross-border issues. I find that there is, notwithstanding the challenges that we have, there are also massive opportunities right now as we are coming out of the pandemic and as governments are really focused on digitalization. And digital payment is really at the center of it, right? Governments are looking for new sources of funding right now, revenues, as they are tackling with the challenges of economic inflation, economic issues in their country. They're looking at challenges of financial inclusion, challenges of SMEs. And so I think there's a real opportunity for us to bring in these different products and services to not only showcase some of the user cases, but also to be a part of their journey. And maybe I think we can make some headwinds. Just the last thing on the sandboxes, I do think Singapore is a great model. It's not just having regulatory boundaries around it. Singapore government also provide resources. It's one thing we just have a sandbox regulation and publish on the website and give a couple of licenses and don't offer any support. I think where Singapore is really good at is providing funding, allowing for companies and fintechs to partner, allowing for innovation in that space. And I think that holistic approach to that sandbox, I think, is critical in developing ecosystem.
Thank you. That's lots of good ideas that I just feel like I have to take notes what we're going to follow up on. Carrie, we're sort of running out of time, but I want to hear what you are saying on this also. So
yeah, I guess I've said it, right? I think there needs to be industry-wide acknowledgement of the importance of last mile delivery of service, right? I think Andrew's here, so I'm going to name BIS Innovation Hub, and also MAS FinTech Office. They really get their hands dirty into those projects and really get a first-hand understanding what that user journey looks like, right? So I think it's important that we don't leave the decision just to a few. I think it's very dangerous, in fact. Otherwise, we keep coming to the same problems over and over. So instead of focusing on the stakeholders when we design about infrastructure and the standards, I think we should think about what that end-to-end flow looks like first, right? In Chinese, we call it 顶层设计, right? Like we always think about, what that picture is going to look like. That's why we are building this framework for that, right? So I think, only if we keep the end user in mind and then empower them with knowledge. I think this is also an area where a lot of companies are pouring a lot of resources into helping SMEs, helping consumers to understand what is a good product, right? What is a good product that delivers good sustainable results? So I think education, training is also very key. So the consumers will drive that market, right? In China, why fintech has taken off, it's also partly because consumers are very outspoken, because like if they don't like something, they will just post on their social, and then it puts pressure on the company and as well. So I think it's a two-way street, right? So how do we also enlarge the pie, make sure more people involved, more people are informed, so we can really bring it to the next level where it's sustainable, where we can really reach that goal we all want to achieve.
Yeah, it's not easy for regulators today because the ecosystem is so much bigger than it was before, so it's hard to know who they need to speak to and who should understand where we're heading to not leave anybody behind.